Being a wise man. What does it mean? Jesus opines on the subject in Matthew, the 7th chapter. He says, "Therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. But everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it fell, and great was its fall." Common sense says, duh, we're going to build not on the sand. I mean, who builds on the sand except, maybe at the beach or something, but still, who builds on the sand? I mean, the house is not going to survive. Common sense. We get it. Of course I'm going to build my house on a rock, on a solid foundation. So what is the big deal? What is it that Jesus is talking about here? I mean, how difficult could it be? Why does this concept seem so simple? Well, first of all, what's the meaning of a wise man? Now, in our society today, we have a certain concept or expectation or an idea of what a wise man is. We think wise, we think smart, right? We think somebody that has intellect, that's educated. We think wise, we think financially wise. Somebody who has a 7 or 8 digit worth. Somebody who has a nice stock portfolio, who's wealthy. We think wise. We think somebody who has some really smart associations, a great network of acquaintances that they're connected to. We think wise. We think somebody that has a lot of experience. But according to Jesus, the wise man is someone who hears what Jesus says and does what Jesus says. You see, according to Jesus, it's not enough just to hear what he says. It's important that we hear and do. So what exactly was it that Jesus was saying that we need to hear and do? Well, this text in the 7th chapter of Matthew actually is the last part of the Sermon on the Mount, which begins in chapter 5. Now, for those of you that are worried about me reading 3 chapters of the New Testament to you, that's not going to happen. You can do that on your own time. But I thought I would take this time to give you the cliff notes because it's important that we understand what these sayings of mine are when we talk about being wise. So Jesus starts this Sermon on the Mount in the 5th chapter. He starts with what we know as the Beatitudes. Blessed are the bankers. I'm sorry. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn. They shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek. They shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those that hunger and thirst. They shall be filled. You get the gist of it? Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the poor in spirit. This is the way Jesus starts his Sermon on the Mount. He continues by saying that as a believer, as a follower of Jesus Christ, you are the salt of the earth. And he says, you are the light of the world. And then he goes on to say, whoever does and teaches these commands, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. There's that word again. whoever does will be great. Then Jesus goes in to finish off the 5th chapter with matters of the heart. Murder and hate and adultery. Matters of the heart. He says that marriage is sacred and binding. He says it's important that we keep our word and go the extra mile. And he even opines on loving your enemies. That concluded chapter 5. Chapter 6 starts out with instructions on how to give, how to pray, how to fast. And then Jesus says this in the 24th verse of the 6th chapter: no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon, or shall I say God and self. That's what Jesus is saying here. You can't serve yourself and God. Then he goes on 9 verses later to say, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. It's important that we seek what Jesus wants and his kingdom first. Hence the term, I am second. Jesus and his kingdom comes first. Then he enters into chapter 7 and gives us some information that's pretty powerful about judging and sitting in the seat of judgment. And when it comes to judging others, maybe that's not such a good idea after all. He goes from there to give us a lesson in persistence. Don't stop asking. Don't stop seeking. Don't stop knocking. Continue to pursue. And then he gets into these 2 ways. He talks about the narrow gate and the wide gate. He says, narrow is the gate and difficult is the way which leads to life, and there are few who find it. This seems odd to us because we're thinking that it's a broad way that leads to life. But Jesus says it's a narrow way, and notice he says the word difficult is the way. We don't like to hear that. We like the easy way. But Jesus says it's a difficult way. And then he gives us some instruction to help us with following others. I mean, you could actually say this can be helpful in finding friends also. He says, you'll know who to follow, not by what they say, but what they do. There's that word again. By what they do, and by the fruit that they produce. And then he finishes chapter 7 with the storm of judgment, where we stand before Jesus, and Jesus says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. There's that word again. Whoever does the will of my Father. This is the setting for Jesus' words about the wise man and the foolish man. This is the synopsis of the Sermon on the Mount. And so let's go back and read it again, taking into account the whole sermon. Therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine, we know what these sayings are. It's the sermon. Not only that those who hear my sayings, these sayings, but it's important that we understand that he says, and does these sayings. He who hears and does these sayings, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. This house that we're talking about here, this house is not a physical house that's built. It's a spiritual house. It's our heart and our soul. It's on the inside. And then he goes on to say, and the rain descended and the floods came and the winds blew and beat on that house. And it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. But everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house. And it fell. And great was its fall. The wise man, then, is the one who hears what Jesus says and does what Jesus says. It's not enough just to hear it. We have to do it. It's not about what I want. It's about what he wants. I have to give up my rights to what I want and surrender to what he wants. Jesus told a story in Luke, the 12th chapter, about a rich man who would be pretty wise in the eyes of most today. It says, the ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought, you get the point? He thought within himself, saying, what shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops? And so he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build bigger barns. And I will store my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up. You have a nice retirement plan for many years. So take it easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. The fool builds for here and now. The fool builds for pleasure and prosperity and for popularity and for power. The fool has no concept, no idea, no understanding, no foresight that there's a storm coming. The next verse says, but God said to this rich young man who thought he had it made, fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you've provided? That's a very good question. I guess the one who dies with the most toys doesn't win after all. You can't take it with you. It can't fit. I'm just saying. Jesus finishes by saying, so is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Who's the fool? It's not the one who hears God's word. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. The fool is the one who hears what Jesus says and doesn't obey it. Doesn't do it. The building is the heart. The home is the heart. And the fool, he can't tell how strong his building is inside until the storm comes. And let me tell you, folks, there's a storm coming. Jesus says, when the storm hits the foolish man's house, it will be a great fall. The storm's coming. Yes, there will be a judgment. But life, our lives, are full of storms. And the storms fall on everyone. They don't discriminate. They fall on everybody. And your foundation is not going to stop the storm from coming. When a tornado rips through a town, as it did on May the 4th, 2007, Greensburg, Kansas was devastated by a 1.7 mile wide tornado. Think about that for a minute. We're not talking about the top of the cloud. We're talking about the bottom where it hit the ground. 1.7 mile swath with wind speeds up to 205 miles per hour. This was a EF5. The tornado traveled rapidly, leveling nearly 1,000 homes. and businesses and taking 11 lives. The storm hit everybody. It didn't jump around and say, oh, I'm going to hit over here, and I'm going to hit over. No. It hit everybody. We're not immune to storms. Storms hit everybody. They hit me too. I'm not immune. 2009, December 29th. Oh boy. One of the biggest storms. You think that 1.7 mile tornado was big? This was huge. The storms, they shake us. They're not easy. And they many times stay longer than we'd like them to stay. But the difference in the storm is the foundation. Building on the rock. Jesus is the rock. He is my rock. He is my sure foundation. He's a solid rock. I can depend on him. Jesus is a living stone. He's the stone that the builders rejected. He's alive. His words are alive. His words give me hope. His words give me life. His words give me a foundation. Everything has to be built on him. His words are solid. His words are unchanging. Jesus' words are dependable and they're life-giving. My heart is his home. I've invited him into my heart. He lives in me. He's alive in me. And because I have this relationship with him and he loves me and I love him, because of that, I willingly choose to follow him. I willingly choose to do what it is he tells me to do. Why? Because in Jesus, I have everything I need to survive the storm. Paul said, we are hard pressed on every side, yet not crushed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed. The foundation is strong. You'll be standing spiritually after the storm goes by. Why? Because of Jesus. It may not feel like you're going to survive. It may not look like you're going to survive. But if we build on the solid rock, if we build on Jesus, we will survive. What's your foundation built on? Because if it's not Jesus, everything else is sinking sand.
For your name, heart and soul, my life is yours, a living stone. For your glory,